And welcome to Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams, your moderator. Joining us tonight, Dr. Bryan Donohue, medical, clinical, and interventional cardiology. Dr. Donohue, welcome back to the broadcast.
Armstrong, it's a great pleasure, and thank you for having me back.
Yes. You know, Dr. Donohue, with all the great advances in medicine we've seen, there's still a huge burden of death and disability from heart and artery disease. It remains the number one killer by far, no matter how many other diseases you talk about, what you talk about people dying of, it is the leader. Nearly 1 in 2 Americans have some form of vascular disease. Almost 700,000 Americans, Dr. Donohue, died in 2021 alone from heart disease. I mean, the cost of caring for these patients in America is an astounding $235 billion a year. Can heart disease be prevented?
Well, you set it up very well, Armstrong. I mean, there's no doubt but that vascular disease, that means heart and artery disease, is by far the leading source both of death and disability. So more than cancer, more than Alzheimer's, more than all these other issues. But here's the other side of the coin, Armstrong. It's also the disease that we are best at preventing. So it's one of my life goals that in this generation, in our generation, the disease that may cost 1 out of 2 of us our lives be eliminated. And so the answer to the question is yes. As you said, this is the prince of all maladies. And so we have to come at it hard. But if we didn't spend, Armstrong, $1 more on basic research, if we didn't spend 1 more man hour on fundamental basic science, but just applied what we now know, the disease evaporates like yellow fever in the steamy swamp. So yes, it can be prevented, and also it very much needs to be prevented.
You know, for someone watching the broadcast tonight, I know this conversation is very relatable, but for someone who doesn't really understand this cardiovascular challenge, you may ask, who gets heart disease? Is it a genetic or acquired disease, Dr. Donohue?
Well, you know, it turns out tragically that a lot of us do. So as we speak tonight, you and I, just under half of all Americans have some form of heart disease. Think about that. So there's an old expression in medical circles that genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger, and there's truth to it. So people do vary in terms of their personal likelihood based on their patterns of inheritance of getting vascular disease. But I like to steer away from that, Armstrong, because that creates the notion that, well, it's all in my genes and nothing much for me to do. All of that is wrong. So the greater your genetic predisposition, the more we need to engage in real smash mouth risk reduction. And risk reduction works independent of what your personal predispositions are. So vascular disease and death occur somewhat more commonly in men than women, although at the end of life, that gap is almost gone. Vascular disease occurs with a good bit of enhanced likelihood among African Americans. It occurs now in rising numbers in Asian Americans. And what really that data is whispering to us is that as we all coalesce around certain patterns of eating and lifestyle choices, it's like drinking our water from the same poison well, and we all get sick and fever and dysentery. So risk reduction has to be an aggressive, very strenuously fought fight. It can't be this kind of, road to hell being paved with good intentions. So diet, Diet's fundamental. When I was a medical resident not all that long ago, for the first time in history, it was shown that blocked arteries can actually, Armstrong, get better. Not just that we hold the tide where it is, but we actually reverse coronary disease. And that was done with no medications, but very aggressive lifestyle changes, which we'll talk about later. So we know that even if you have vascular disease, it's not too late. It's not too late to engage in the strenuous fight. Paul made the point in 2 Corinthians, you'll remember, that we don't own, but that we steward the body. And nowhere can I think of that that's more important here than preventing and avoiding vascular calamity.
You know, I want to follow up on your discussion of blockage. You know, we hear so much about how cholesterol causes blockages in the heart arteries. Is that true, and can cholesterol be lowered enough by diet, or do patients with increased levels need medication?
You know, Armstrong, it's been said that two things can simultaneously be true. So we attack suffering from all sides. What we've learned over the last 5 to 8 years is that the old milestones of proper cholesterol lowering were nowhere near enough. So our viewers know that there's so-called good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Let's talk about bad cholesterol. So when you go and get your blood drawn, you get a total cholesterol, an LDL level, that's the bad cholesterol, and an HDL level, that's the good cholesterol. Really what matters here principally is the bad cholesterol. If you ask yourself how much water, how much rust do you want in the household water, the answer is none. Likewise with LDL, lower is better and very low is best. So there's very good data now, Armstrong, that even in people, again, with already established narrowing of the heart arteries, when we lower the LDL, really lower it, I'm talking to levels of like 30, those people can enjoy actual regression, meaning the degree of plaque begins to melt, like the snow in Vermont in May. So it actually improves. So what we end up thinking here is that plaque narrowing is really a sign of injury to the artery, sort of like pushing the plow through the field and the farmer's hands become calloused. So there are ways now of clearly reversing that process. But again, it's a muscular approach. So yes, the diet changes and changes in my patients rather radically. And medicines are used.
You know, we've heard that diet can reverse heart disease. Is that true? Do we all need to be vegetarians, doctor?
You know, there's no single diet, Armstrong, that's right for all of the viewers that you have across the fruited plain tonight. But it is true. It is absolutely true that if you said, what's the best way for me to either not get vascular disease, or if I have it, to allow it to improve, it would be a fundamental change in diet. So a plant-based diet was how way back in the 1980s it was first shown in a group of men in Marin County across from San Francisco, that when they engaged in radical dietary change, stress reduction, an agenda of exercise and social support, this was the first group in which the before angiogram or picture of the arteries and the after angiogram was clearly better. That had never been seen before in human history. And so that's something that we should take advantage of. So in general, you want to do certain things at least. You want to stay away from saturated fats, and you want to stay away from an excess of meat, steamed pigmented vegetables, beets, carrots, squash, broccoli, cold water, ocean fish, if you take animal protein, cod, halibut, salmon, flounder, mackerel, bass, grouper, and a little bit of steamed rice. That's sort of the staple diet, and we can vary it from day to day and so forth, but that's what about 2/3 of the world's population eats. That's what we ate in ancient times. Cod was the principal source of animal protein for centuries. So getting back to that is a good idea. Remember how it was that the master chose to feed the hillside crowd with fish. And there's something very bioprotective about fish. But yes, we do need to all modify our diet. We really begin, Armstrong, the task of risk reduction when we exit our comfort zone.
You know, you did mention that word stress. We hear that stress damages the heart arteries and can lead to severe disease or even death. Is this true, though? Are there proven ways we can reduce stress in our day-to-day lives that have been shown to reduce heart disease risk?
Well, there are, Armstrong, and this also is rather recent data, but it is the case that the National Institute of Health, right there down the road from you in Washington, D.C., has funded some very large studies that have shown some amazing things. So stress is part and parcel of life. None of us can avoid the stress of getting out of bed and providing a service and dealing with our family. Those are all things that are just embedded in our daily lives. Our goal, though, is not to be victimized by stress. So it's not like we're going to live behind some kind of cocoon. We're going to go out and live a vibrant life. We don't have thin skin. But on the other hand, there is a consequence of stress. And so if we could devise ways to lower the impact of stress in our health and well-being, that's a valuable thing. So the first thing is certain forms of meditation. So the National Institute of Health has looked in some detail at a particular meditation technique called Transcendental Meditation, or TM. And it turned out to be the case that the regular practice of this meditation technique resulted in, wait for it now, a 48% reduction in cardiovascular risk. That is an eye-popping state of affairs.
You know, Dr. Bryan Donohue is our guest, and I'm just so engrossed in this conversation. I know you are also, because, you know, there's something that we can do to change our health. We can change our diet. There's something that we can do, reduce stress, reduce our exposure to these cardiovascular diseases. And we're going to continue with Dr. Bryan Donohue on the other side of these breaks. I'm Armstrong. And welcome back to the broadcast with our very distinguished physician, Dr. Bryan Donohue. Dr. Donohue, what are some of the primary causes of heart and vascular disease, and why is it the leading cause of death?
Well, it's the leading cause of death because, alas, it affects the heart, the center of our being. So it affects the heart, Armstrong, in ways which for so many millions of Americans, they're completely unaware. Consider just for a second that somewhere between 325 and 375,000 Americans a year die of sudden cardiac death. That's not because they were ill-informed or were not paying attention to their body. It's because the first expression of vascular disease was their abrupt, unheralded demise. So this is not a disease that pays one penny in advertising. It lurks in the innermost of our innermost aspects of our being. And it turns out to be true, interestingly, that people who have sudden cardiac death, people who have heart attacks, very often, in about 70% of those patients, Armstrong, they have rather mild plaque narrowing. So about 70% of people with sudden death have a 50% or less narrowing that caused the problem. So if they got a stress test, it would have been normal. If you said, how are you feeling? They would say, fine. So there it was, this curled up viper in the tall grass that they were totally unaware of, and that usual detection methods fail to identify. So this really is a very, very unique aspect, Armstrong, of vascular disease.
There's got to be some warnings, some symptoms, even for those that die all of a sudden and you say they had no notice, no sign. There's got to be something there that you can share with us, Dr. Donohue.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, Armstrong. My own career has been centered on the care of patients with sudden death and heart attacks. So we actually, even in the first group, are able oftentimes to resuscitate those patients and get to know them. So, we've had quite a good bit of success in taking patients found down by the softball field for a long time and getting them into the cath lab and finding what's wrong, and in many cases, getting them back. And when you talk to those patients, it is the case that very often these are out of nowhere events. On the other hand, methods of detection have improved so much. So there's now a way of looking directly, Armstrong, at your heart arteries without doing a heart cath. That means that our viewers can actually have a study that shows their heart arteries, that identifies early blockage or no blockage. And it's also interesting, Armstrong, that we have a way now of assessing the age, the biological age of the heart. So there's something called the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, or MESA. And that data set lets the readers of these studies identify how old your heart is. I, for example, had one such study, and the age of my heart is 36. And so the arteries, a great doctor said back in 1699, he said, a man is as old as his arteries. So we can now look at the arteries and see if they're diseased and act earlier.
Let's talk about lifestyle, Dr. Donohue, and the choices that we make that impacts the overall development of heart disease, and how can we make better choices?
Well, Armstrong, I said before the role of genetic inheritance. Let me tell you that it's way overplayed. Really and truly, our fate is in our own hands. So if we make lifestyle changes, and let me share with you the observation of 44 years of doing this. People say, in a kind of moment of soft bigotry, oh, those patients, they're not going to really. Patients listen. Patients act on their own behalf. Patients do amend their lifestyle to great advantage. And shame on us as providers for not emphasizing these strategies with enough conviction. So here's the basic, in a word, the rules, the kind of rules of the road. I want your lipids lower and as low as you can get them. If I drew the LDL of a 6-month-old baby, you know what the number would be? 0. So real low LDL, listen now, no matter how you get it, is fundamental to feeling well at 100. Super low LDL protects against dementia and cognitive issues, which are so often themselves vascular. So knowing your numbers and wanting that your LDL is at or below 70, if you have other risk factors, at or below 55. Don't tell me it's normal. Normal is the number where 1 out of 2 of us die of the disease we're proposing to prevent. You want it normal for you, for your future self. The second thing is exercise. Armstrong, if we exercise just for 3 hours a week, I didn't say a day, just 3 hours a week, we enjoy a 40% reduction in death. Think about that.
Wow.
So shame on us. Think about that number.
Whew.
So there's little else we can offer that has that promise of sustained well-being.
Can you explain the difference between the clinical and interventional cardiology and their roles in prevention?
Yeah, so people that actually do these procedures, that actually take patients to the heart cath lab, open arteries with stents and all of that, are intervening in the course of the disease. So those cardiologists have had added training in the, if you will, invasive techniques that have been used to such great advantage. The occurrence angioplasty comes from the Greek. It means repair of the blood vessel. So more and more and more often now, we can fix arteries that are blocked in the cath lab without resorting to the way more intrusive and to some extent violent intervention of heart surgery. So interventional cardiologists have had those added years of training that are used in these procedures. So I, for example, trained in both clinical and subsequently interventional cardiology. So in the cath lab, you see what a heart attack really is. You look into the red eyes of the beast and see what it is that would cost this patient their lives if you don't get this wire down and open the artery with a stent. So it's not for everybody. It's a rather hair-raising business. But I'll tell you, the flip side of that is there's nothing on earth that compares to changing the whole trends of time for a patient in about 45 minutes, just changing everything. And those patients, they know what happened to them. And when you tell them, get off the roast beef, quit the Winstons, weigh throughout your life what you weighed or should have weighed at 21, you have a very receptive audience.
Of course, regular checkups are so important, and the regular screenings and detecting this heart disease early. Why is it that people, when they have this information, they still refuse to go for their regular checkups and screening?
Because Armstrong, they feel well. So you're talking about risk. It's an abstraction. So if, people take the sense now that I spoke today to a patient who's fabulously wealthy man, has made all these movies and done this and that, but he has such a high level of risk. And he says to me, well, I have this trainer come by and we do cowbell swings and all this. Let's not be, let's take the concept of risk seriously. You take it seriously in every other aspect of your life. You have some money that you've allocated to this or that agenda so as to preserve your assets. You lock the front door at night so as to maintain your safety. And yet your LDL is through the roof, and it turns out it's the pothole that you don't see that breaks the axle during wintertime driving. And so we want to convert the unseen danger into the seen danger. And once you show that to people, they're very responsive. So it, for example, is a huge disadvantage to be even a little bit heavy, huge disadvantage. My old chief of medicine used to tell us that we all need to weigh throughout our lives what we weighed or should have weighed at 21. And I always wondered, is that really true? Absolutely true. So being obese, having elevated glucose, sugar levels, having insulin levels that are elevated, these are all conspiracies against our sovereignty, and we need to take up arms against those sources of hazard.
A lot of us talk about genetics and the role that it plays in the heart and this vascular disease. Are there ways to sort of mitigate, reduce these risks, doctor?
Well, there are. And so in the same way that if you lived in a very high crime neighborhood, you might have 2 locks on the door and you'd make sure you latch the window. Likewise, if you personally have increased genetic predisposition, then you want to just, breathe fire when it comes to risk reduction. You can lower your risk regarding essentially all forms of inherited genetic predisposition by traditional risk reduction. Okay, so that's what I want people to know. I don't like this sense of, man, I got these bad genes. My father had this, my mother had that. Here's how it really works. If you're the first order proband, that means mother, father, daughter, son, first order relative of someone who had sudden death or a heart attack at or below the age, listen now, of 45, that markedly increases your risk. There's very few of us in that group, but they exist. And even in those groups, we do certain added studies to show what it might be that you inherited, and we can take arms at that. So most of our risk is what we acquire. Most of our risk is the direct and predictable consequence of the choices that we make. So we begin the campaign, Armstrong, of risk reduction with a long look in the mirror. Go into the bathroom, close the door, strip down naked, and ask yourself, am I doing the best job I could do? And for many of us, that answer is clearly no. And we remember that all of us have an identity that comes to us from the Lord on high. So we're all worthy of that effort and agenda to preserve and protect ourselves.
You know, Doctor, we must say thank you for joining us. But in 5 seconds, you must share with those that may just be joining the chat what it means to exercise, how much it extends your life if you just do 3 hours a week.
If you do 3 hours a week, here's what I want people to know. All of us watching the show now are breathing comfortably. That would be breath level 1. If I were exercising strenuously and Armstrong asked me a question and I really couldn't answer it, that would be breathless level 3. We want to be breathless level 2, meaning that if Mr. Armstrong Williams asks me a question, I can answer the question, but I'd rather not. That's the level of exercise we want to get to. We don't start off that way if we've been sort of puddles of flesh watching reruns of Gunsmoke, but we work to that level, and we can work to that level. And the other thing about exercise, it's not a penal colony. It should be fun. So many of us get up at the crack of dawn and run when the day is new. Others of us dive into the pool. Whatever is fun for you. But here's the thing, just do it. Don't make it some abstract something. Do something, do it for about 3 hours a week, and you'll find that the wind in your forehead is a fabulous medicine.
Dr. Donohue, thank you so much for joining us. Such a really refreshing, necessary conversation during the holidays. When we come back, we're going to turn our attention to the Chinese and the dissidents and the people they persecute. That and much more on this edition of Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. You know, I've always been fascinated with Falun Gong. I've always have wondered about the persecution of people who have this spiritual belief, how they're so persecuted in China, but yet their rights are different if they live in Hong Kong. And why are they such a threat to the Chinese way of life? And so when I realized that Levi Browde, who's the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, was joining us tonight, I was very much looking forward to the conversation. And thank you so much for joining us. What is the significance of Jinping's reported secret meeting on Falun Gong?
Well, it's huge. It's a game changer because for 25 years, while the Chinese regime has been trying to persecute and eradicate Falun Gong inside China, they've engaged in the largest transnational repression campaign in the world against Falun Gong outside China. That's largely failed. And I think, now that we know that, according to at least two of these sources, Xi Jinping came in, acknowledged that they'd failed, and said, we have to radically change how we attack Falun Gong in the United States and around the world. And that's essentially what we're seeing.
What does that mean?
That means really silencing the voices, because out of Falun Gong, it's not just a dissident community, it's also a community that has given rise to companies and organizations that are the leading voice, really, in many respects, about not just exposing the persecution against themselves in China, but really saying this is the history of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a threat to everybody, including here in the U.S. So really exposing the CCP on the world stage. And I think that's the real reason they're so targeted.
How are they treated? Talk about the history. People talk about the organs. You talk about the persecutions. You talk about the death. Take us inside.
So the story of Falun Gong is intriguing and tragic, but if you go back to the 90s, it was very different. In the 90s, Falun Gong was everywhere. It was the pride of the nation. It was in every park all around China, because it was the first time in decades under communist rule that a spiritual practice had come along that's heartland Chinese. It resonated with Chinese, and by the end of by the turn of the century, there were 100 million people practicing. And so for that whole decade, virtually, of the 1990s, it was beloved. But when the Chinese regime found out there's way more people practicing Falun Gong than there are members of the Communist Party, that's when the top leader said, crush it. I don't care what it is and what it signifies, crush it. And so virtually overnight, in the summer of 1999, if you're a Falun Gong practitioner in China, you're essentially a Jew in 1938 Germany. Kicked out of school, fired from your job, rampant torture, rampant death from torture. And then, as you mentioned, after a few years of this persecution campaign in the mid-2000s, they started taking large quantities of Falun Gong practitioners who, they don't drink, they don't smoke, very healthy, they meditate, and they started holding them in largely military hospitals and harvesting their organs, killing them, so that they could have this booming organ transplantation business in China.
So what new strategies were reportedly discussed to suppress Falun Gong internationally?
What they primarily did is they said, okay, the normal Chinese regime propaganda wasn't working, primarily because people don't really listen to the Chinese regime. They know it's propaganda. So they said, okay, we have to find certain points that will resonate in the West, and we have to have Western voices say those points. And so the whole campaign was predicated on the idea of let's establish a beachhead in social media, because they can control that more, and have a bunch of people just spread all kinds of disinformation about Falun Gong, but stuff that would really resonate in the West, and try and bait the Western media, try and bait our own government agencies to open up inquiries on Falun Gong, or primarily the Shenyun company, which we can talk about in a moment, and try and mobilize it so that they literally said in these documents that we got, it wasn't just Xi Jinping's meeting, we get leaked CCP documents where the Ministry of Public Security is saying, we need to make it so that all of the American populace hates Falun Gong, essentially, that's what they said. And so that's what they've done. They've changed the tune, and they've worked to leverage, it seems, their economic and political clout here in the West, to have Western voices be the ones condemning or quote-unquote exposing Falun Gong and Shenyun.
But how does this international strategy fit within China's broader foreign policy goals?
Oh, I think for them it's essential, because they came to power. I mean, what is communism? It's an import from Germany, right? It is a foreign ideology. It is a foreign power. It took over China. And all this time, one of the main things they've done during the reign of the Communist Party from 1949 to today is try and completely eradicate traditional Chinese culture, their beliefs, their cultures, their ways of doing things, because it was so deeply held and it was so against Marxism. They wanted to push Marxism on the Chinese people. So their whole power structure relies on the idea of succeeding in that, convincing the Chinese people and the world that they are the true shepherds of China, its culture, and its people, and indeed that's a lie. When they started persecuting Falun Gong and Falun Gong started speaking out against this in various forms, they were now telling the world, look, there's a big difference between China and the ruling CCP, and we need to understand that difference. That's a threat. That's a threat to the fundamental rationale that the CCP sold to the Chinese people on why they're the legitimate rulers. And they look at this as an existential threat type of issue. And that's why they're so vigorously going after us.
You know, how has human rights organization responded to these reported developments?
It is very tricky. And I think the reason it's tricky is because the Chinese regime has been very good at leadership capture, organization capture, influence in the United States, in the United Nations, in Europe, all around the world. And so even if human rights groups, or even if it's a government agency, it really depends on, you know, what is their disposition towards China, what is their relationship towards China. There are scholars, there are journalists who openly admit we can't cover this issue and this issue, because if we do, we lose our access to China. And if I'm a China expert and I lose my access to China, what am I losing? I'm losing my livelihood. Well, that's an example of a power dynamic that occurs almost in every segment of our society. And so it is very hit or miss on whether the human rights groups, whether governments, whether civil groups are going to stand up and say something, because they're risking the wrath of the Chinese regime.
Well, you know, you're implying something here, because it begs the role that Western governments play in either enabling or countering China's tools.
Yeah, and it is from what I've seen, it's complicated, and it's getting worse over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, this wasn't a problem necessarily, but the Chinese regime has been able to exert enough power and influence that has become more and more problematic. I mean, we see, well, just last year, right, there was a professor at Harvard that was arrested by the FBI and is essentially working as an agent for the CCP. Well, that's everywhere. I mean, just last year there was 2 guys in Orange County that were caught up in FBI sting because they were trying to bribe the IRS to target Shenyun Performing Arts, which is the performing arts company started by Falun Gong practitioners. So this has been going on for years, and it has made some inroads. And I think this is the thing that we really, you know, I think both this administration and the last administration has sanctioned China for people who've persecuted Falun Gong, but they need to go much, much further in disentangling all these levers of power. I think that the CCP has gained in the West. It's been very disheartening to see.
You know, I would love for you to sort of give us a brief insight into how they go in and corrupt these professors, use their money, use their power, and compromise these institutions right in our backyard. And it just takes, we can't separate what is real from what is just pure propaganda of the Chinese government.
One of the leading China scholars of the last 50 years, his name is Perry Link. And he wrote I remember he wrote an essay, maybe it was 15 years ago or so, called Anaconda in the Chandelier. And the principle was essentially that once the Chinese regime was entered into the WTO and was brought into the world community and it was very sort of entrenched in our society, it's not always direct enforcement of the rules. He described it as an anaconda in the chandelier, if you can imagine what that would feel like if you were in a room with a giant anaconda in the chandelier. It's this looming darkness that they have imposed on academia, on media, on some governments, where they don't tell you where the line is, but you're afraid to cross it in case they pounce. And this effect has had a very chilling effect on, you know, in this case, I think Perry Link was largely talking about China experts, but what he was talking about is that, you know, again, it comes back to, if you're a China expert, access to China is your livelihood. And if they revoke that, they take that away, what are you? And that threat of taking that away is not just academia. What about media? You're kicked out of Beijing, you can't cover the The Olympics, you can't cover stories in China. That's happened to some media. What about businesses? How many banks and different businesses that have a website about their offices in Shanghai and Beijing? Well, what happens to them if they start speaking out on a third rail issue that Beijing cares a lot about, like the Falun Gong? So there is a tremendous amount, a disturbing amount of power and influence that they do exert. And I think what we're just starting to realize is how that affects what we read in our newspapers, what our own sort of policies are towards China. It goes fairly deep.
You know, Levi Browde is our guest. It's just fascinating to watch because, you know, they've been at this a long time and they've got tentacles everywhere, even in the White House, even in Congress, even in our courts, everywhere. And we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
Talk about what your the kind of backlash that your organization has faced since your involvement with Falun Gong.
So the human rights organization that I run was, for many years, just focused on China. But as we started to learn more about what the Chinese regime is doing around the world with transnational oppression, we started to expand what we're looking at and analyzing. And so half of what we cover now is not just in China, it's overseas. And at this point, I mean, this year is unprecedented in terms of the Chinese regime's focus on the Shenyang Performing Arts Group. And starting this March, as an example, to answer your question, we started getting, at the campus of where Shenyang is, where I go often when I'm talking to people, I'm doing my research, we get bomb threats, threats of mass shootings, at this point, once every 2 weeks.
Wow.
Threats to rape and kill the female performers of Shenyang. I mean, that's a commonplace occurrence. It hasn't happened. We've got security at the gates. You know, we've got different measures in place. But that's that's just one aspect of this whole thing, of trying to squeeze and target this campus where the Shenyang Performing Arts Company has its headquarters, and they've really made a focus out of it.
You know, what about the asylum seekers? Are there many?
With Falun Gong, for many years it was the most popular way that people were coming out of China, because it was the biggest persecuted group. And so, yeah, you see a lot in the Falun Gong diaspora. There are people who fleeing persecution in China. In some cases, their family were killed. They went through horrific torture, and they were able, usually through a UN system, they would get asylum status in a third country, and then they work with the United States, and they would be able to be relocated here. And so you do have quite a number of people in the Falun Gong diaspora in the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the world that fled persecution in China. And that's, you know, it's very real to them. Unfortunately, for many of them, they still have family and loved ones back in China.
How does this all, what China is doing, and they're not even trying to hide it, how does it impact international law?
Honestly, very little. Very little what I've seen. I mean, in terms of impact of changing behavior of what happens to people inside China if the Chinese regime wants to crush them, very little. I mean, there's some things on the surface. Many years ago, for example, probably because of international scrutiny, the labor camp system in China was abolished. But the reality on the ground is, if you're a Falun Gong practitioner, now you're more likely to go into a black jail or a prison or some other detention or brainwashing facility, not the labor camp.
You know, it's interesting. You know, we talk about what China does to those who are a threat. I mean, what about for you personally and people involved with your organization? How does it impact you in a personal way? You're a target.
Personal security becomes very important to us. I have to do things I never thought I'd have to do to protect my family, my home, that's for sure. But I think the real tragic story is, you know, we have people like Shenyang Performing Arts has a principal dancer, his name is Stephen. Last year, his mother was sentenced to 4 years in prison in China because he's here participating in the Shenyang Performing Arts group. And so the security issue is not just us here, but for those who have family or loved ones back in China, it's a grave concern for them. And that kind of thing happens all the time. People get a knock on the door from police in Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou, wherever they are, because they're known to be a Falun Gong advocate overseas. They're known to be a dancer with Shenyang Performing Arts.
What else would you like to share for us with us in the time that we have tonight?
I think what's most shocking, I think, for all Americans, not just the people who advocate for Falun Gong, is that the way the Chinese regime is targeting Shenyang Performing Arts is a blueprint for how they can go after any company, any organization, any individual here if they want to sabotage it, cancel it, destroy it. And I think that's what's really disturbing about this whole campaign that, you know, Xi initially announced a couple years ago and that we see going on, is that this is a mechanism. They're developing an ability to target people here on U.S. soil. And that's, I think, what's very scary.
What role do Chinese embassies and consulates play in these global efforts?
Oh, they're at the forefront. Just coming back to the Shenyang Performing Arts example, when Shenyang wants to go and perform at a theater in the U.S., in Thailand, anywhere, invariably, Chinese diplomats will send a letter, email, knock on the door, pressure that theater, pressure that mayor to not have Shenyang perform. Wow. In the Dominican Republic, they chased the president down at the airport and had issued economic threats and so forth to get Shenyang canceled.
The president of the country?
The president of the Dominican Republic was chased down by the ambassador of that country. So it is open. They don't hide this. We have letters and emails of Chinese diplomats all over the world trying to cancel Shenyang, trying to sabotage Shenyang. It's open warfare.
Are there parallels between China's actions against Falun Gong and its strategy to suppress other groups?
That's very interesting you ask that, because what they do is they're very good at, unfortunately, taking a repressive mechanism in one group and applying it to the others. There were torture methods that they literally refined on the Falun Gong over more than a decade, and they would actually take a prison camp or a labor camp that was good at it, and they'd travel around China to teach the other prison camps. Forced organ harvesting, where they're murdering Falun Gong people for their organs. Guess who's now a victim of that? The Uyghurs, and by some accounts, underground house churches, Christians. And so they will take a mechanism of suppression on one group, and they will then use it on the broader populace. Another quick example, they pioneered the Great Firewall and some of their surveillance mechanisms initially to try and track and monitor Falun Gong. Well, now they're monitoring the entire country. All 5 billion people, 6 billion or whatever it is. Now these surveillance mechanisms, they were not only Falun Gong, but very much developed and pioneered on Falun Gong. They're now using that to surveil and go after the entire populace of the country. So these mechanisms, this is what they do. The Chinese regime is not economic wizards, they're not civil engineering wizards, they're not wizards really in anything but repression. This is the one thing they do. This is how they seize power. This is how they maintain power. And when they have something that kind of works, they will spread it, for sure.
How do China's actions against Falun Gong align with its use of influence and propaganda abroad? And then also, what can be done to protect Falun Gong practitioners living outside of China?
The reason they go after Falun Gong is one of the reasons is that, again, this is one of the communities that directly challenges their soft power, and their soft power is very important. It's actually a kind of a misnomer to even call it that, because the Chinese regime, one of the main things it's trying to do continually for decades is to get the international community to buy into them as legitimate rulers of China. And Falun Gong and groups like that are kind of a leading voice of saying, you know what you're dealing with. This is the true nature of the CCP. And so the soft power thing is extremely important to them. And what we can do, like what we did with the Confucius Institutes, for many years, the Chinese regime was opening these Confucius Institutes in our universities and teaching their version of history, their version of Chinese culture. The whole reason to do that was to sanitize the image of the Chinese regime and the ruling Communist Party there. We got wise to that, and we started shutting those down all over the country. That's what we need to be doing with all of their tentacles of soft power, with all of their modes of aggression. And that's why the Falun Gong issue, and this is why I keep impressing on people, is not just a Falun Gong issue. Because if we can stand up and prevent them from creating disinformation and suppressing Falun Gong in this country, we're also preventing a mechanism they're developing. Because once they do it to Falun Gong here, they won't stop there. They'll do it to other groups. And that's why we need to sort of look at these groups like Falun Gong, which is kind of the canary in the coal mine, and say, how do we stop this? How do we protect it? Because if we can do that, now we're protecting the whole country for whoever they seek to go after next.
What is your, in the 2 minutes we have left, what is it that drives you to continue this, and what you see as your success that the Chinese government just despise?
To some extent, it's this country. Shenyang Performing Arts could not have been created, I believe, in any other country in the world, because Falun Gong came here and they created a performing arts company that was going to demonstrate true culture of China to the world that was a threat to the Chinese regime. If that was attempted in any other country, I think the power of the Chinese regime would be overwhelming. They'd shut it down. The government would cave. One of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons I find the Falun Gong issue so fascinating, it is a litmus test on whether we can stand up for American liberty, stand up for the city on a hill kind of idea. And when groups come here, when people sort of build a life here, are we going to be able to protect that against the tyrannies of the world? That's one of the reasons I find this to be a fascinating issue and a worthy cause.
You know, how can people learn more about what you do?
They could go to the Falun Dafa Information Center website, which is Falun Info, F-A-L-U-N Info, INFO.net. And there we cover not only what's happening in China, we cover the transnational oppression here and the so what. What is this impacting and what we can do to stop it, this kind of thing.
You know, I cannot thank you enough for your courage and your leadership on this and having principle and willing to stand up, and also put you and your family's life on the line every day. I also want to thank Dr. Bryan Donohue for joining us here earlier, and we wish you both well. I'm Armstrong Williams, your voice, your future, Town Hall.